We are not going to give that money back to Russia. That is a fact.
Is this legal under U.S. law?
And if you're an America First Republic, it's a question politically.
I want some yachts,
and so we should do it.
Is personal for me.
President Biden has the authority to transfer Russian assets to Ukraine. It's very simple.
Thank you all so much for coming tonight. My name is Uriel Epstein. I'm the CEO of the Renew Democracy Initiative. And we are an organization dedicated to combating the global alliance of dictators and highlighting the threat that they pose to democracy around the world. Back in the spring, RDI commissioned a report to investigate the legal underpinnings for the US to not only freeze Russian assets, which it's already done, but to confiscate them and transfer them to Ukraine. And this is something that's significant. The size of the prize here is well over $30 billion. And so Professor Laurence Tribe, Raymond Tolentino, and their brilliant colleagues at KHF, one of whom is sitting right here, two of whom are sitting right here, I apologize, have poured their hearts and have worked incredible hours over the course of the last half a year to pull together this report. And what this report seeks to do is set up the legal framework for how it is not only possible for the Biden administration to do this, but how it is ultimately morally necessary. So with that in mind, I want to allow my co-panelists here to briefly introduce themselves. And I actually would begin with our surprise co-panelist, Tom Malinowski, a close friend and ally and partner. And so Tom, maybe you can quickly introduce yourself and then we'll go down the line.
Tom Malinowski, former member of Congress from New Jersey, worked on the very first legislative proposals after the Ukraine war to do just what this report recommends.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for allowing me to be here tonight. My name is Ray Tolentino. I'm a partner at Kaplan, Hecker, and Fink, which is a law firm here in town. I'm a constitutional lawyer by training. I clerked on the Supreme Court for Justice Sonia Sotomayor and graduated from Georgetown Law. And I'm currently a professor at Georgetown Law and Howard University School of Law. It's a pleasure to be here.
Bill Kristol, editor-at-large of The Bulwark, editor of the Weekly Standard. Before that, I served actually in the Reagan and first Bush administrations, and it was in the first Bush administration where we did a version of this with Saddam Hussein's assets after his invasion of Kuwait. So
Bill, you're getting ahead of us.
I of course have no memory at all of this. This was before Uriel was born, before some of the lawyers who worked on this report were born, I believe. So I have very little to contribute here, and I want to apologize ahead of time that I'm going to have to really run out at about 7:35 because I foolishly agreed to do something else right after this. That is time. I can't really change the time. But it's a great pleasure to be here. I'm on the advisory board of RDI, and I'm so pleased that they were able to do this report, and thank everyone who helped make it possible.
So to get us started here, Raymond, maybe you can just lay the background, context, and grounding for the report.
Of course. I know you all probably already did the reading, all 120 pages of it, so I'll keep it short. But our legal analysis essentially has two central pillars. There's the domestic law side, is this legal under US law? And the international law side. As a matter of international law, could the United States transfer $30+ billion of assets, of Russian sovereign assets that are currently housed in the United States to Ukraine? So let's start with the first, the US domestic law. And the report lays this out in pretty significant detail. The first principle that's sort of important to keep in mind is that in the realm of foreign affairs, the United States president under the US Constitution has sweeping authority as our commander-in-chief and our chief diplomat. And so the constitutional structure gives President Biden a significant amount of power and leeway. And that power is especially pronounced when Congress passes a statute that says you are allowed to do certain things in the international sphere. And our report identifies one such statute, and it's called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. We call it IEPA for short. IEPA was passed in 1977 and gives the president broad authority to take certain executive actions, even without court authority, even without congressional action, in times of international emergency. And there are different facets and different powers that flow from the statute, but the one in particular that we focus on is subsection B of the statute, right? And subsection B says the president, if he declares an international emergency, the president gets to, quote, block and compel the transfer of another country's property, right? And so just by its text, our argument goes, President Biden has the authority to transfer Russian assets to Ukraine. It's very simple. A kindergartner can understand it. And so we hope that the Biden administration understands it. But there's also
Not that there are any comparisons being made.
No, not at all. But you know, it's a very simple textual argument, right? If there is property that can be transferred in an international emergency, he's allowed to transfer it. And luckily, there's not just textual support from that in the statute, there's actually historical practice. So Bill will get into one of the examples that he played a central role in vis-a-vis Kuwait and Iraqi assets. There's also the Iran hostage crisis. There's an important Supreme Court case called Dames and Moore, which we cite to in our report. And in that case, it established the authority under this provision to do exactly what we're proposing here, to transfer a foreign country's assets to another country in need without any court authority, just by virtue of the congressional power vested in the president. So some people who oppose that type of maneuver say that transfer is illegal because it violates the constitutional rights of Russia. And they invoke several principles, the due process clause and the takings clause. Our argument is that they don't have takings and due process rights. We are constitutional law scholars, so you just have to trust us on this. But it is long settled that under US constitutional law, foreign nations do not have those types of constitutional rights. And because we are not using the courts to effectuate the transfer, it's sort of a permissible way of going about this. The last thing I'll mention on the domestic law side, and then I'll quickly run through the international law elements of our report, is there's a concept called foreign sovereign immunity, which essentially says if a foreign sovereign is hailed into US courts, they can claim immunity. And so a lot of people have been talking about, oh, doesn't Russia as a foreign sovereign have immunity from this type of action? The answer is no. And the answer is no because we don't involve the courts in our proposal. President Biden can, through OFAC, which is in the Department of Treasury, effectuate this transfer without involving any US courts. So that's the domestic law side. In our view, it's clear that President Biden has legal authority under domestic law. So let's pivot to international law. And under international law, it's a little bit more complex. This part of the report is a little bit longer because there's many more moving parts. But our basic conclusion is that as a matter of international law, under what's called the doctrine of third-party countermeasures, G7 countries who have Russian sovereign assets housed in their banks can transfer those assets because Russia has blatantly and brazenly violated international legal norms. We lay this out in extensive detail. It's a little bit of a harrowing account for those of you who read it. You will see the sort of repeated violations and attacks on Ukrainian civilians. It's staggering. I think it's a sort of powerful account to just sort of read through everything that Putin has done to the Ukrainian people on the country. And so we lay out the various international norms that have been broken. It's a war of aggression that is unlawful. It's a crime against the Ukrainian people. There are accounts of rape and murder of civilians and children. We reference the crime of genocide and the Genocide Convention. There have been reports about basically trying to Russify Ukraine and to sort of stamp it out of existence. And then there's the failure to pay reparations. And again, we think that dates back to 2014 in terms of the annexation of Crimea, but it continues today and is put into even more stark relief with the invasion in 2022. So in our view, it is a permissible countermeasure. You don't need Russia's consent to transfer their assets when they've broken the law. And it wouldn't violate, again, it wouldn't violate their sovereign immunity because they've sort of trampled on another country's sovereignty. And when you do that, there are ramifications under international law, and states like the United States, nations like the United States and its allies can take permissible countermeasures. So that's it. It's legal as a matter of U.S. domestic law, legal as a matter of international law. So really what it takes is sort of moral and political will for people to do what's right. And we would urge the Biden administration and other countries to do so.
So very quickly, Raymond, Secretary Yellen immediately, I believe either upon leaving Ukraine or shortly thereafter or in the country, was asked about this exact thing. And the specific concern that she mentioned was that she believed that there would be significant legal trials and tribulations which would prevent the administration from moving forward. So do you feel like this report and these efforts sufficiently answer her concerns?
We do. We do think that they sufficiently answer her concerns, and we would, if we were in a room with Secretary Yellen, would respectfully urge her to take a look at our report, because I think we dismantle a lot of the legal objections to taking this sort of action.
Well, so this brings us to the next step, which is the political. So if it's legal to do so, there could nevertheless be legitimate political concerns and geopolitical concerns and economic concerns with taking this action, right? Ranging from fears of de-dollarization to fears of precedent setting and so forth. And so, Bill, I want to throw it to you. And if you could kind of highlight what you see as A, some of the key concerns outside of the legal, and B, how you would respond to them.
Yeah, and I happen to be in the first Bush administration and in the White House and the senior staff, the vice president, chief of staff. I actually have no memory of all of this and was not involved in this. I was happy that we froze and Saddam's assets, of course, and then we gave them over to, I think it was kind of the UN body that was administering the reconstruction of Kuwait. There had been there'd been legislation which sort of sanctioned this in Congress. Tom can talk about how maybe such legislation would provide an additional comfort maybe to the administration, and this would be bipartisan, I'm sure, if it were passed. Tom was pushing for this way back in 2022, and that might help on the political side. So it's not just an arbitrary decision by the president or a few people in the administration. But for me, I mean, it's look, there are legitimate, the president has authority to do a lot of things that he chooses not to do. And sometimes he's right to choose not to do them. And sometimes he chooses not to do them, even though the moral case for doing them might be quite strong. And even though one is disgusted by the actions of various foreign governments, for example, it's not like China isn't committing a certain kind of genocide vis-a-vis the Uyghurs. It's not like other, we might not want to do more with Qatar, which is hosting the head of Hamas, and he's giving televised proclamations from there. And there are complicated geopolitical considerations, right or wrong, and this is something that has to be debated about why we have certain policies towards other countries that do things not just we disapprove of, but that are arguably in violation of international law, that are fostering terrorism even, and so forth. But I feel this case, I do think, is Putin's invasion of Ukraine and the brutality of it and the genocidal character of it is so extraordinary that I think in this case that overwhelms what are sometimes sensible concerns about we don't want every government to not, and citizens of other countries, governments of other countries not to use the U.S. banking system because they're worried that, we won't like some policy that their government adopts or some vote they cast at the UN, or they take sides against us on something, and suddenly their money is tied up, and that, you do want to, if you want to be a safe financial system for people to invest in, but not for genocidal dictators who have brutally invaded their country and the neighboring country and are now conducting the largest war in Europe, in the world, maybe actually, in 80 years. We're in the world in 40 years. I haven't really done the math on this, but pretty close, certainly in Europe, And so I think this is a case where the equities, to use a legal term maybe, are on the same side as the kind of legalities. And it would be the right thing to do. And it would symbolize the fact that this is, and I'll just close with this, because I'm so struck by this. I mean, this is such a big moment, and what happens in Ukraine, what happens in respect to Putin's attempt to take more of Ukraine and to kill Ukrainians and actually ultimately to destroy the country and the people is so determinative, I think, for the next decade, 2 decades, I don't know, the whole 21st century. It's such an inflection point that it's not a normal moment where the president might decide on the advice of the Treasury Secretary and of Citibank exec CEO and so forth. I'm making up Citibank, no offense to them, but whatever bankers get called in, that, this is, maybe we should just forbear. This is really a moment where we should do everything we can do to help Ukraine to win. And this is one of the things we can do. And so we should do it.
So before I throw it to Tom, I want to go back to you, Ray, very quickly, because Bill mentioned the potentially precedent-setting nature of this act. So I want to ask, what are the limiting principles that have sort of been laid out in the report, highlighting how this genuinely is unique and how ultimately most countries in the world, short of invading a neighbor, shouldn't be worried about parking their money in American banks?
Sure, and I'll have to give a shout out to my colleagues, Kate Harris and Jackson Urbanbach, who helped develop these limiting principles, but I think they're important. The first couple I've already described, which is that the legal constraints themselves under domestic law and international law serve as limiting principles. The president can't just willy-nilly do this, and other countries can't just willy-nilly do this without justification. They have to go through the steps to justify it under the domestic law, the relevant domestic law of the country that's seizing the assets, and under more broadly international legal norms. So those are, I think, the two biggest constraints. But there are also pragmatic constraints. I think the pragmatic restraints can be sort of developed ahead of time, ex ante, or after the fact, to say, look, we only do this in contexts, for example, if a state uses military force to invade a country at the scope that Russia has done here, plus it's sort of the option of last resort. It hasn't responded to other less harsh punishments. So for instance, we've levied historical sanctions against Russia. It hasn't worked. Right. So I think there are very easy limiting principles that you could draw, and we've set them out in our report, that are rooted in the law, but also rooted in pragmatism and practicalities of international relations.
So I want to quickly turn over now to Tom and talk about what this could actually look like in practice. So Tom, both in your role in Congress, but previously you were also Assistant Secretary for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, although I never get the order of those three things right.
All important.
That's right, not in order of importance. There we go. What could practically speaking, what could a mechanism, so if the administration were to decide to move forward with this, and we're talking tens of billions of dollars, what would a mechanism for actually taking that money and transferring it to Ukraine look like?
So before I answer that, I want to say that we should stop using the word if. I want to talk a little bit about the real politics and practicality of this idea. I feel like I was present at maybe the creation of the idea. A few days after the Russian invasion, I was at the Munich Security Conference and with a congressional delegation, and I was standing up talking to the great and brilliant Senator Sheldon Whitehouse from Rhode Island. And we were talking mostly about oligarch assets in this conversation, because it was a little bit easier to visualize at that point, the bank accounts, the yachts, the villas, and the Riviera. And, we were having a serious conversation, how can we structure a legal framework to ensure that we can use these assets for helping Ukraine? And then Senator Lindsey Graham walked up to us and overheard our conversation and just said, I want some yachts. I want to get me some of those yachts. Tom, get me some yachts. And I'm like, okay, we have to down, Lindsey. Got to do it responsibly, but we got to do it. And then we came home and I started calling State Department and Treasury Department. And at this point, it's like the mid-level officials, and they respond horrified, like, oh no, this is a terrible idea. We couldn't possibly do it. We don't do things that way. And that was a little discouraging. And then I thought about it a little more. And then I realized, no, this is going to happen. Because number one, and first of all, it's not tens of billions, it's hundreds. It's $300 billion between us and globally, mostly us and Europe. We are not going to give that money back to Russia. That is a fact. That's not advocating that. That's just a fact. Unless Putin is overthrown somehow and there's a new government in Russia and that government pledges to pay reparations to help in its own way to reconstruct Ukraine. But apart from that circumstance, we are not giving $300 billion back to Russia. Even if there is an end to the war, even if Ukraine takes back all its territory, that's crazy. And I don't think any of us will be satisfied with just allowing $300 billion to sit in banks for eternity, doing nothing, maybe making interest that we're using. Like, that's silly too. And so if we're not going to give it back to Russia, then obviously we're going to do the logical thing, which is to use Putin's money to help rebuild the country that Putin is destroying. That is, speaking of kindergarten, that's something anyone can understand, that the basic morality and logic of it is so obvious and plain and simple. So we know the destination. We know exactly what the final stop on this train route is going to be. We just have to build the tracks to get there. And it's complicated because there are very legitimate concerns and questions. And it does have to be done in a way that involves these limiting principles. It does have to be done in a way that doesn't completely spook the international financial community. And so I think what you guys have done is incredibly helpful in pointing the way there. We're going to have to do this in Europe as well. So only a fraction of this money is in the United States. If all we do is get it right in the United States, we haven't achieved our goal. And so there are a lot of governments in Europe that are also a little spooked by the enormity of this idea. We're talking about giving our governments an awesome power to take something permanently without a judicial process. It's the right thing to do. I think it can legally be done, but it's still an awesome power. And because we're responsible, I think we do have to think through how to make sure that it's limited. The ultimate mechanism, I think I'm convinced by the legal arguments you guys have made. I do think it would be helpful, as Bill said, it would give us all more comfort if Congress were to pass a law. And in fact, Sheldon Whitehouse and others have introduced a bill called the Repo Act, which I think helps us do that. I think it would be helpful to point to rulings of international tribunals. The Europeans, with support from the United States, are working on a tribunal on the crime of aggression that would prosecute Russian leaders. First time since World War II or post-World War II, this would have happened. Again, that would be helpful in making the point we only do this for countries that have invaded another country to seize territory, committing war crimes. A ruling by a tribunal like that would, again, help legitimize an extraordinary action like this. And then ultimately, we're not just going to write a check to the Ukrainian government. There would be, and the Repo Act in Congress envisions this, that there would be, in effect, a trust fund set up in the United States for the money that's present here, but that the United States would also negotiate with our European partners and other countries that have these assets, an international trust fund to which we would contribute from our trust fund that would manage the distribution of this funding for the reconstruction of Ukraine. But again, back to the original point, it's going to happen. And again, partly for the reasons I stated, but also because it's going to cost hundreds of billions of dollars to rebuild Ukraine. And you can see how hard it is right now to get the money for the Ukrainian military offensive through the House of Representatives. Our politics is getting complicated. There's no way Congress is going to appropriate hundreds of billions or tens of billions of dollars for reconstruction. And American taxpayers shouldn't pay for that. French taxpayers shouldn't pay for that. Ukrainian taxpayers certainly shouldn't pay for that. So there is a huge demand for this. There's a huge need for it. We have the money. We just have to figure out the mechanism, and this helps tremendously.
I want to come back to Tom. One of the last things you said, which was around the political realities of the situation, where we're our Congress isn't exactly in the best of shape. And so our report, the report that our colleagues and friends at KHF have pulled together does not foresee a necessary role for Congress in making this happen, that this is ultimately the role of the federal, of the executive. But of course, Congress could add pressure, right? There are political questions to this. And so, Bill, I want to turn to you. So on the one hand, there was a Washington Post piece that dropped yesterday that highlighted the fact that there is movement within the administration, and it appears that Secretary Yellen and others are getting closer to taking this action, which, as Tom pointed out, is ultimately inevitable, much like the tanks were and ultimately the F-16s will be. But that they're starting to move closer. So I want to get your sense of the pulse on the Republican side of the aisle. I mean, you're not necessarily beloved these days on the Republican side, but Bill, I imagine you still have your finger somewhat on the pulse. What's your sense?
Yeah, my finger's pretty far away from that pulse, actually. It's not a very nice pulse, really. So why should I spend too much time trying to discern it?
Do they even have a pulse right
Yeah,
now?
well, that's another. Yeah, what's the opposite of a pulse? Like when you just crazed, spasmodic gestures. I don't know. I mean, on the one hand, so some of the Republicans. I mean, if you're an America First Republican, it's an interesting question politically, and Tom would have better sense from his former colleagues on this than I probably. I mean, there'll be many Republicans, Mike McCall, the serious Republicans, Mitch McConnell, who will be, I assume, for this, as they have been. And I think the proposed legislation had bipartisan sponsors.
100% bipartisan.
Yeah. So I don't think it will look like a partisan thing. It'll be an interesting question for some of the Republicans who are opposing the current military aid and other aid, whether they also want to defend. Giving this money back to Putin? Are we willing? Josh Hawley and those people, and to say nothing of Trump and DeSantis and Ramaswamy, willing to go that far? Or I don't know. I was going to say I would have doubted, but of course they could go anywhere. God knows where they would go. And secondly, I think one of the politics of this I really just don't know. I made that joke about Citibank earlier, but I mean, how much pressure will there be from the financial institutions and sort of financial world that this is a little risky and this isn't worth it, and we get huge benefits by being such a trusted creditor and depositee, whatever the right word is there, recipient of funds from all over the world, international capital flows. Well, I can see the arguments here, but I don't know. Do you feel like, you all have worked on this. Do you think is American big business, big finance going to be okay with this?
Yeah, but so here's what I think. There are two Republican parties right now, certainly on Ukraine. The pro-Ukraine faction will be all for this. The anti-Ukraine faction, there's some interesting dynamics. There's some of them will be tempted to be for it, but for the wrong reasons. And this is a little thing that worries me right now. I could see a Marjorie Taylor Greene saying, oh my God, this is great. We don't have to appropriate another penny for Ukraine. We can just use this money. Why are we asking, and right now this is important, but what's existential right now for the future of the free world, I mean that literally, is getting the money, the supplemental for Ukraine through the House of Representatives. This is not for buying tanks and ammunition and artillery shells. This is for rebuilding the country over the next 10 years. And so some of the MAGA anti-Ukraine Republicans could potentially like this as an alternative to doing what they don't want to do and what they must do right now, or at least allow the House to do, and that's appropriate the supplemental. I think the only reason why any of them would be against it is that there is a deep, deep suspicion among more libertarian-leaning Republicans to the idea of government asset seizure. So last year, in 2022, I did get a modest piece of legislation through on this issue. The legislation allowed the president to transfer the proceeds of seized assets to Ukraine without further appropriation. So normally, the way asset seizure works is that we seize assets from a criminal in a judicial proceeding, it gets deposited in the US Treasury. And then Congress gets to appropriate money from the US Treasury for whatever it wants. But what we did was we proposed a bill that would allow the president, without going back to Congress, to just transfer it to Ukraine. And totally bipartisan, but it did actually get held up in the Senate for a while by some of these more libertarian members who saw it as analogous to things in the United States that they're opposed to. And actually, there's some legitimate concerns about law enforcement asset seizure overreach in the United States. So that gets a little complicated. So I think those would be the two dynamics. I have little doubt. In fact, I'm 100% sure that legislation that's been proposed can and will pass so long as it gets a vote on something. The obstacle is just the dysfunction in the House, where even if you have the votes, you can't be sure you're ever going to get a vote. And so that's where we are now on the more important and urgent piece, and who knows on this down the road.
With that, I think we can probably close this portion of the evening. I also want to thank the Victims of Communism Museum for this incredible space. I mean, honestly, I'm actually kind of shocked that I've never been here before. So I encourage everyone to explore the museum. They currently have an exhibit on the Holodomor, which is a period of starvation in Ukraine imposed by the communist regime. So with that, again, thank you. Please mix, mingle. We'll be around. And I look forward to seeing you all soon. Thank you.